Thank you. Thanks for that. So, it was a few years ago, and it was a really warm day, this one day, in the Arctic. It was -10 to -15 degrees Celsius, and that was the best that we could hope for. And we were on the first day of this expedition to cross the remote Penny ice cap on Canada's Baffin Island. Baffin Island is the 5th largest island in the world, and it's the 3rd time that I've been there on this particular expedition. I've done 6 expeditions in the Arctic Circle, the other 3 being on the the other 3 being on the European side in Svalbard, Arctic Norway, and Arctic Iceland. So Baffin Island is the 5th largest island in the world, and despite it being twice the size of the UK, no one's heard of it. It's only got 11,000 inhabitants, making it one of the most sparsely populated places on the planet. Our expedition was attempting to cross the Penny ice cap, opening up a new route. We'll be travelling from Qeqertarsuaq through over the Penny ice cap, and hopefully at the end of the expedition, a month later, end up in Pangton on the. You can see, you might make that out in the image on the right hand side. At the start of the expedition, we'll be dropped off by our Inuit outfitters to a place a little bit closer to the ice cap from the island of Qeqertarsuaq. From there, they would leave us all our equipment and our food and our fuel. They'll leave us there, and they'll hurtle back on their snowmobiles to their warm communities and leave us there to start the expedition. They often think we're absolutely mad when we undertake such journeys, but for me, especially, I find that initial snowmobile the worst, because the wind chill is excruciating. But the views are marvellous. We pass icebergs that have been frozen in place and stopped on their voyage south by the freezing seas, and they tower above us, stories above us, and the silence is deafening. And you can see, probably on the right-hand side of the image, lower down, you can see a person and some of our snowmobiles, and you can just appreciate the size. We pass seals that are sunbathing outside of the snow holes, and you see? Yeah. We pass seals that are sunbathing out of the snow holes, and as we're driving past closer, and they quickly scurry into the snows, into the seas below. And Arctic hares race past us, somehow managing to carry on up a 50-degree slope at the same speed. It's incredible. And then on this particular journey, we came across these footprints. And there's only one animal in the Arctic that can make footprints like this, and that is the polar bear. But as well as these large set of footprints that you see in the middle of the screen, you can see 2 smaller sets of footprints either side. And those are undoubtedly of a young family of 2 young cubs with this mother. And they're disappearing off into the distance of the same way as we're going. And you can really appreciate the size of those footprints when I put my hand next to them. It's incredible. And so it wasn't long before we came up to the family of bears themselves, and it was a family, a mother and 2 young cubs, and those cubs were probably only out of the den only for like a couple of days. They were really just stretching the legs for the very first time. But our noisy snowmobile spooked the mother, and she ran really fast, and we stopped and watched as the cubs and the mother were running away, and the cubs were struggling hard to keep up. And as we watched, we saw one of the cubs falling further and further behind, until there was a point where the cub stopped in its tracks and utterly confused about what to do. It turned around, looked at us, barked, because that's the sound that actually polar bears make, which I didn't know until then, barked, and started running towards us. And that was the cutest thing I have ever seen, the second cutest thing I have ever seen, but also the most heartbreaking, because that cub cannot survive by itself. It was decided that it would have to intervene. So with our snowmobiles, we chased the cub back into the right direction, and it worked partially. It found its mother's footprints, and started following them. But his mother hadn't waited. By now she was kilometres away, as well as the other cub. And we knew that that cub would probably not make it back to its mother. So we decided we were going to have to intervene further. So we used the snowmobiles as pincers, and we tried to block off its path before jumping off the snowmobile and trying to grab the young cub and to try and bring it back to its mother itself. But that's easier said than done. Polar bears don't like to be caught. Its teeth are sharp and its claws are long, and he didn't stop without a struggle. I managed to capture the end part of this story in a short film.
We're trying to get this cub back to its mother, but it's of course doesn't want to be caught, and it's going to bite.
At this stage, I took over driving one of the snowmobiles, and I could not video record and drive at the same time. The next clip you see is after we have caught the bear using the tent to prevent it and us from getting hurt.
We'll just take it to the mother.
So at the end of this epic, we've caught the polar bear, and Billy's just taken over from me from driving, and we're releasing the other polar bear. There he goes. He's just attacking. Oh, he just got caught. He's going the wrong way. So the mother's on the hillside, the cub, there he is, and there she is on the hillside. She's now waiting for him, and hopefully he will get to her. There's the mother and the other cub, and there's the baby. Polar bear trappers. How high?
That's a bit unusual for the mother just to leave, just like that.
She was very scared.
They usually wait for the cub.
How high?
Good thing we catch up the little one to the... I don't know.
Yeah.
What's better?
Absolutely amazing to see that family reunited again and a cub to be accepted back. But by now we were many hours behind our expedition start, and we were and we used up most of our fuel in chasing that cub. The only way we could get to our expedition start point was to cannibalise all the fuel from one snowmobile and us all pile into the existing final snowmobile and get to our start point. As the sun began to set, we unloaded all our gear, and we started making camp as the nighttime descended and temperatures dropped. And Billy and Charlie, our Inuit outfitters, they then head-tailed it back to their community, probably driving all throughout the night to get there. But at least they had a warm bed to get to. Billy, the Inuit outfitter that you saw in that film there, he was telling us that actually they are seeing more and more polar bears in the village than ever before. But scientists who have been studying polar bear populations are becoming increasingly worried about the polar bear. So which of these is right? You know, either there are more polar bears or there aren't. Well, bizarrely, they both are, but that is not good news for the polar bear. The polar bear is a highly adapted Arctic predator there's an evolutionary process that's happened over thousands of years. There's a thick, dense fur, leaving no skin exposed, and each hair is hollow, allowing to trap as much air as possible for insulation. It has a thick layer of fat, which keeps it insulated and keeps it buoyant for those cold Arctic swims. It has these huge feet that help disperse its weight on the snow, and bumpy footpads that allow it to grip and run on slippery ice. Its huge feet make for great paddles too for swimming. It has strong and powerful limbs, and that long and narrow skull combined with very strong neck muscles means that the polar bear is a bold predator, allowing it to jump head first into the snow and to catch steels and have the strength to pull them out. The polar bear does all of its hunting on the sea ice. It relies on the sea ice for all of its life functions, to track and find a mate, for breeding, to find prey, and it only survives on land with the fat reserves that it has developed over a successful season of hunting. But the sea ice is more important than just for the polar bear. The sea ice underpins the entire Arctic food system. It acts like an upside down soil, where at the on the underside of the sea ice, algae and other photosynthetic phytoplankton can grow. This is fed on by small little animals called copepods or other zooplankton. And in turn, these are fed on by Arctic cod. Now, Arctic cod is the main staple food diet for almost every marine Arctic species, from the beluga whale to the narwhal to almost every Arctic seal species. So in short, no sea ice means no cod, and that means the whole entire Arctic food system breaks down. And the sea ice is disappearing. Periodic data from NASA's satellites from 1979 to recent times shows that on a decade by decade there's been a 13% drop in sea ice continuously over that time. In September 2012, the sea ice reached a record low, and it was estimated that only 20% in volume of sea ice existed in comparison to 1979, which isn't a very long time frame at all. It is incredible and it's completely unbelievable about how quick that sea ice is disappearing. And the sea ice may not be around until, when I first wrote this presentation a few years ago, it was estimated that the sea ice in the summertime will be around in the 2050s, and that's when it will disappear. That has already been reduced to something like the 2030s. The sea ice is reducing due to the warming atmosphere and the climate, and that is due to surging carbon dioxide and methane emissions that are pushing greenhouse gases to record levels, and it's that instability in our climate that is causing the sea ice to melt. Recent studies have been comparing the levels of greenhouse gas emissions that exist today to the last time in history when they were at similar levels. And the last time they were at the similar levels as they are today was 2.7 million years ago. And at that time, sea levels were 20 metres higher. Now that could very well be, in fact, that is the best estimate of where a well will get to and will stabilise at. Now, that certainly won't happen in our lifetimes because it takes time for these actions to happen. But if there's any chance that we have in order to prevent that from being locked in and from happening, the window for closing is only a few short years. So the melting ice means that there's less ice for the polar bears to go hunting and all of their functions on. So they're going onto land earlier and earlier, now looking for food. The keen sense of smell brings them into the human communities, and in particular the rubbish dumps. And in that conflict between humans and bear, it's always the bear that comes worst off. Now, I'm really fortunate about having this next clip to show you. Silverback Films gave me this clip to show in my presentation, and it's a clip from one of their series called The Hunt. So, after that fateful day that we had with that rescuing that polar bear, it took us 19 days to get across the penny ice cap, and it was for a land called the Iotic National Park, which means the land that never melts. On the top left picture there, you can see what our tent would look like in the mornings with the snow developing on the inside of the tent. And we had to build snowballs each evening in order to stop the winds from blowing our tent away or destroying it. And we had to keep all of our skin covered up and leave no skin exposed. But after 19 days of skiing on the ice, we were only a day away from reaching Pangaton, the community, where we'll hopefully find a hot meal and hopefully a shower. And so we were really motivated when we went to bed that last night. to get to Paddington the next day. But that next day, we woke up in a blizzard. The whiteout confuses and disorientates, and you cannot tell the sky from the ground, and the only thing we could rely upon to find our direction was our compass. But we were really motivated. It was the last day. We were going to get to a civilization soon. So we slowly continued skiing. Only about 6 kilometers away from Paddington, coming into the last couple of hours of what should have been the last couple of hours of the day, I came across a section of a dark patch of snow, and I was ahead. I was leading at this point, and that can only mean one thing, and that means that the snow is wet. And looking behind me at the tracks of my skis, I could see that the tracks were filling up with water, and now that can only mean one thing, and that is thin ice. But because in the blizzard of the whiteout, I could not see, or we could not see how far this area extended. Was it local? Was it extended? In which direction was thicker ice? So tentatively, we took steps forward, checking that the thickness of the ice, that it was solid enough before taking the next step forward. I hadn't progressed more than 100 meters when I heard the unmistakable sound of ice cracking. And I whipped round, and I could see Anthony in the distance. Great. But actually, there were 3 of us. Where was Duncan? And looking down, twisting further, I could see the dark chasm of a hole opened up in the ice, and seeing Duncan having fallen through the ice into the sea below. This was an incredibly dangerous situation. First of all, we had to fight our urges to rush over to try and help Duncan, because he was already in some really weak ice that's been weakened further by falling through. If we had approached this hole and it had broken further, we could have made this dangerous situation into a complete disaster if we had all fallen through into the hole below. Duncan had to get out of the hole by himself. So whilst Anthony and I prepped a rope from some sort of extraction technique, which we had no idea about what to do, we encouraged and shouted at him to get out of the hole by himself. So far, his suit and all of his insulated clothing were buoyant, but they were slowly filling up with water, and soon that buoyancy will become a dead lead weight and drag him down. He had to get out fast whilst he still had the strength and still had that buoyancy. After recovering from that initial shock, he moved to the edge of the hole. Fortunately, his poke hadn't fallen down into the hole with him, otherwise that would have definitely pulled him under. And he moved to the hole and he put his elbows out onto the edge and he tried to drag himself out, but the edge broke away and now the hole was even bigger. We shouted abuse at him to hurry up and do something more, and so he moved again to the edge, and again it broke away. This time we shouted, try a different edge, go to the other side of the hole, which he did. This time it held, and he managed to crawl himself out of that hole and onto the ground, onto the solid ice that we were there. But now his clothes were soaked. His insulating clothing does not work when it's soaked, and the blizzard was still raging. That wind was hitting us, whipping away all our heat, and so we had to move, keep him strong, but keep him warm, keep him strong. But we were also on really thin ice, and so began the most challenging period of the expedition on that last few hours. But we did make it in the end into Paddington, and we saw the silhouettes in the distance of these geometric shapes, square black silhouettes, and that does not happen in nature. And when we saw that, we knew that those were buildings and that the community was there. We were really surprised to see that at that time of the year, the sea ice was so thin that we were falling through. It shouldn't have been like that. It should have been thick enough for it to continue. But that is the new reality that we have to get used to. And in fact, one of the main rites of passage that explorers and adventurers like to go on is the skiing to the North Pole from land. Hasn't happened in the summertime since 2015, or in fact 2014. The attempts in 2015 all had to be rescued because the sea ice was too thin, and there hasn't been any attempt since. The only attempt that I know of this year is actually happening right now in the winter time, in the polar night, because no one can trust the summertime ice anymore. Now, will anyone ski to the North Pole in the summertime again? It's highly unlikely. There are a few things to realise when we're discussing kind of climate change and what's happening in the Arctic. The Arctic is at the vanguard of of climate change. Temperatures are increasing in the Arctic far higher than the rest of the world, but they are increasing everywhere the same, equally. And on top of that, what is happening in the Arctic has a big influence on what happens in the rest of the world, actually. When I first wrote this presentation, it was in the winter of 2015, and I was sitting in a cottage in the Lake District writing this, and at that time it had the worst rainfall in over 100 years. A storm had passed through, bringing torrential rain that broke away all flood defences and had flooded towns and villages and destroyed road networks. And that was a once in a 100-year event that happened. A week later, another storm came through. And a week after that, another storm came through. And so it was no surprise, actually, that December 2015 was the wettest year on record, the wettest month that we've ever had. But it is pretty pointless about talking about these records because they're broken year on year on year. The rate and the frequency of these extreme waves is increasing. And in fact, that wetness that we experience can be directly related to what is happening in the Arctic by how the jet stream is being impacted. The jet stream is a meandering river of wind that travels from west to east, and it is the main method of weather systems to be moving from west to east. One of the major important factors about how strong the jet stream is the temperature differential from the warm tropics to the cold Arctic. And when there is a large differential, so there is a warm tropical area and a very cold Arctic regions, the jet stream is strong and it's fast. And those meanders that you see in the jet stream are very slight. However, in the instance that the temperature differential is very, very, very low, so that's i.e. A warming Arctic will cause this, that those meanders become larger and the jet stream gets slower. And those meanders brings weather with it, such as cold, wet weather that we experienced, that we are experiencing more in the UK in the wintertime, and flooding as a result. Across the pond, that is bringing intense cold spells into places like USA and Canada, and that is due to the effects of global warming, how the Arctic is being affected. However, the understanding of our political office and our political elite leads to comments like this, which is completely, which you can only roll your eyes to. On the flip side, you have extreme heating happening in places like the Middle East. A particular study considered a particular event that hasn't really occurred in all of human history, and that is when temperatures increase greater than 35 degrees Celsius in extremely, extremely humid conditions. Well, the body can no longer sweat, and sweating is the primary means that our bodies use to regulate our own body temperatures. And if the temperatures are above 35 degrees C and the humidity means that you cannot sweat, it means the conditions are lethal if you're caught in an unprotected environment. This has never happened before, but this study and the models that they've created show that towards the end of the century, we're going to begin seeing heat wave and conditions like this emerging in the Middle East, in places such as Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha. Now, rich countries can afford, to have people in air-conditioned environments and air-conditioned cars, but certainly poorer areas will become completely uninhabitable in these regions. But even in rich air regions, if your car breaks down somewhere in one of these conditions, well, it will be lethal. It will be literally a lethal condition on Earth to be outside in an unprotected environment. All of these conditions is causing issues with bigger issues with our food security. Floods, droughts, extreme weather events, and more frequent events is going to cause massive issues with security. This image here you can see in the middle of the screen shows, it's a bit hard to see the colours there, but it shows the variability of food insecurity that is today from going light beige colour to a dark brown colour. And here is an image of how that will change in 2080. So you can see that the areas that you see major changes in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America, and all of those areas will become more and more food insecure. And that will lead to greater regional conflicts and environmental refugees, greater in the millions, things that we've never seen before. And we've already starting to see this, the movement of people in Central America moving northwards to try and get into America via Mexico. Well, those are environmental refugees. They're moving because their crops have failed and they can no longer feed themselves. And equally, some of the reasons why people believe that there's a huge surge of migrants moving from North Africa and trying to get across the Mediterranean into Europe is because that, again, is from food insecurity. And we can only expect to see more and more of this. And already these events are already putting strains on the limits of the human rights that we hold so dear. And you can only imagine that this year upon year, those strains are gonna get bigger and bigger. But the worst is yet to come, I'm sorry to say. Some of the things that climate scientists are most concerned about is these positive feedback mechanisms that could switch on. Some of them are already happening, some of them haven't yet started. And these are changes that have happened as a result of warming within our climate, our atmosphere, or on the land or in the sea, that then encourages further heating, and you could end up in a vicious cycle of the heating being encouraged by these events, which then encourage these conditions to exacerbate. One of the worst, actually, is what could happen to the permafrost. The permafrost, here's an image of some sort of permafrost that I took whilst in the Arctic, is a region of land, about 19 million square kilometres, if I remember correctly, around the northern hemisphere, which is permanently frozen land. And within that is about, I believe, 1,700 gigatons of carbon that's sequestered within that permanently frozen land. Now you can imagine that what's going to happen there with the Arctic warming. That's all going to melt, and all of that carbon that's locked away from rotting vegetation and animals that have died over millennia is slowly going to emerge as methane, and it's going to bubble up into and escape into our atmosphere. The 2013 IPCC report estimates that there is about 300 gigatons of heat trapping carbon pollution will be emitted into the atmosphere over the next 85 years. Now, you know, what does 300 gigatons means? Well, if we consider that all of the human emissions of greenhouse gases between 1750 and today, that accounts for about 540 gigatons of carbon. Now, 300 gigatons is adding over 50% onto top of that, and that is without doing anything. Adding that on top of what we've already released, well, that would completely nullify any attempts that we have in order to limit the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we're producing. Now, paleo researchers, they've looked at the last time that all of that permafrost was melted, and it was in a time when temperatures on Earth were on average 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than they are at pre-industrial levels. We're currently at 0.85 degrees Celsius higher. And the melting has already been starting to see in the permafrost, and as a result, that methane is already starting to release. It is clear that climate change is going to have a negative impact in all aspects of our lives, everywhere across the world, and it's clear that we have to do something about it. But there was good news when I wrote this presentation in 2015. It was the first time in history that after 30 years of discussions and of talking of all these government panels coming together, 30 years, they couldn't come to an agreement until 2015. And in Paris, 190 countries got together, every country in the world, and agreed that for a binding agreement to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, well, you know, remember that permafrost stuff earlier? You can see that these targets don't agree with anything that science tells us. But it's a target nonetheless, it's something to draw upon. And a non-binding target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it's the first time in history that's been done, and it was incredibly positive. The top graph over there, then it's just about legible, I guess. It shows, the red line shows what would happen to global average temperatures if we didn't do anything, business as normal, as if we continue as we are doing today. And global average temperatures would approximate about 6 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial levels. And the blue line shows what we will do to limit it to 2 degrees Celsius. And what that means is, if you move down to the lower graph, is how that affects greenhouse gases. And looking at that blue line, it shows that we need to reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions year upon year at a greater and greater rate until the end of the century to have any chance of meeting that. So what has happened since? So this chart here shows the estimated current emissions trajectory. It's an estimate of where we're going with the levels of emissions, and it's a steady increase of about 60 billion metric tons. After the agreement in Paris, which is a binding agreement, all of the countries had to come up with pledges about what they were going to do in order to meet their targets, in order to ensure that this 2 degrees Celsius target is met. And the next graph shows the collection of all of those pledges and how it will affect the trajectory of greenhouse gases. And can anyone see a difference between the two graphs? Yeah, it doesn't really make much sense, and that's because the pledges that people have made, or the countries have made since then, have been, pretty much minor, and certainly countries, big emitters such as USA, completely pulled out, quite famously, of the Paris Agreement. And to put it into context about what needs to happen, here is a chart showing what needs to happen with greenhouse gas emissions year upon year in order to meet the Paris Agreement of 2 degrees Celsius. Now we can already see, based on some of the slides I showed earlier, about 2 degrees Celsius is already a really bad target to aim for. And so there's been a complete failure in our political system in able to deal with this crisis. So far I've only been talking about climate, so I've just got one slide here actually showing what else is happening in our biosphere. And at the same time, as a result of all of the same mechanisms that we are doing in order to create all of this climate emergency that we're facing, we're also creating the 6th greatest extinction event that's ever happened. Some people call it actually an extermination because it's not a benign event. We are knowingly causing this. And the most striking thing about these 3 graphs actually that you should realise is that the 1970s wasn't a great baseline. I'm sure the older members, anyone old enough there, will be able to tell us that before the 1970s, wildlife was already plummeting at record levels before that. And certainly anecdotal evidence in papers and in people's novels is tantamount to that. And that is happening across the world. So let's bring it back to what is happening what will happen in the UK. In a few years' time, we're going to start to see crazy events that we'll never imagine that we'll be talking about the UK about. I mean, water shortages in the UK, that's something that we would expect to hear about for sub-Saharan Africa. And we could start seeing major food shortages, not just in the UK, but you're talking about continent-wide. It would literally be a breadline because there will be no additional food that we can buy in from anywhere to feed us. But I believe before all of this, one of the before all of this, our societies will be threatened by something that's going to happen sooner, and that is the sea level rises and extreme events such as flooding happening more and more frequent. And there's this village, Fairbourne, on the Welsh coast, which is the canary in the coal mine at this stage. And in this village, they've been told that there's going to be no attempt about saving or creating flood defences to stop the village being flooded by rising sea levels. And overnight, all of a sudden, their greatest assets, all of the residents of this village, their greatest assets, their houses, are worthless. You can't sell them. No one's going to buy them. And that is showing one of the greatest, or rather, one of the most important aspects of our modern lives. We live in this modern society with the knowledge that our possessions and our livelihoods are assured, are insured, and most of that is through insurance. Now, when we can no longer get that insurance, when insurance companies are no longer going to insure our houses for flooding, then all of a sudden they're completely unsellable, and when they're unsellable, they are worthless. We're going to be seeing sea level rises greater than the 1 metre level that was estimated in Fairbourne. That has already created a situation in Fairbourne, all across the country. Now, I'm part of the All Parties Parliamentary, an All Parties Parliamentary group in London, at Parliament in London, and being part of that group means I get to see some briefings and planners about what's happening in conditions with the polar regions and how people are reacting to that. And we had one talk about what the Thames Estuary 2100 plan was, and the Thames Barrier plan is that they are getting ready to be replacing the Thames Barrier with something that can deal with a 2 metre rise in sea levels. Now, is the rest of the country doing that? And the answer is no, not at all. Now, certainly they don't have the budget, but they're certainly not doing that. Now, what will happen in areas that are quite low on floodplains, such as the Somerset levels? Now, there's thousands of houses there. When you can no longer insure those houses, they will be worthless, and that will happen throughout many areas of the world. And certainly Cirencester, how will Cirencester cope with a 2 metre rise in sea levels? You'll see more and more extreme events, more and more flooding events. Certain areas of Cirencester, I'd say, would be experiencing flooding upon flooding to the point that living there is pointless and we're able to sell them. So it's clear that this is an existential threat to all of our systems, wherever you are in the world, and including being in a rich country such as ours. And we have to find a new way of doing things and new technologies. But some changes we cannot influence. That's on governmental levels and intergovernmental levels, across the world. Such as power and energy production, which is of course one of the greatest emitters of greenhouse gases. But there are major impacts that we can make as consumers and we all know about cutting down flying and trying to reduce the amount of flying we do. But we've got to look about viable alternatives. What we can do, what can we replace it with without changing our lifestyles too much, and we can still achieve having a fruitful life. And it's about viable alternatives. And one of the biggest industries that we can affect every day actually is the animal agriculture industry. And that accounts for 14.5% of all greenhouse gases emitted. And that is greater than the entire transport industry combined. And the reason for that is that livestock, and in particular cattle, have a unique digestion system that emits methane out of the digestion system, and their waste produces nitrous oxides. Now, both of those products are many times as powerful as greenhouse gases, as potent as carbon dioxide, with methane being 25 times as potent and nitrous oxide about 300 times as potent. On top of that is extremely inefficient, and in fact I was quite shocked when I saw this statistic that livestock is the greatest impact that we're having on the world, where 30% of ice-free land is dedicated to livestock farming, and it's greater than what's allocated as wildlife, which only counts as 25% of ice-free land. It is clear that the 2 degrees Celsius target or any target has to include a dramatic reduction in livestock farming, and that has to start with demand, and meat and dairy has to be reduced significantly. But like I said, there are also other industries that have to be impacted, and that doesn't start with demand, that starts with pressuring governments and intergovernments to do that. So, it's blindingly obvious of what we've seen in the last few slides that things need to happen. But why haven't they? Well, in the current political economic situation that we're in, there hasn't been any competitive advantage for countries to go unilaterally go greener. And when we are, when we've got a system about creating perpetual growth in a finite planet, well, it's always a race to the bottom. As Bill Clinton said when he was being elected for US president, it's about the economy, stupid. And that is the short-termism that we're trapped in. And so we need to find a different way of doing things. And if we cannot win within and find a different way of getting through this in the current system, well, then we need to change the system, and we've got to fight by different rules. And that's where places like, that's where groups like Extinction Rebellion come in. And they're important in spreading the word about what is actually happening, because it's clear that politics has failed in dealing with this, and it is an existential crisis that we are facing. And their demands actually look really quite obvious, really. I mean, the first thing they're asking for is that, well, if everyone knew exactly what is happening to our climate across the world, then the citizens will demand change. And so the first demand is that governments take the ownership of that information and properly distribute that out without whitewashing it or trivializing it. Their second demand, and actually I also think that this is important as well, they're saying that changes has to happen in a very short time, massive change in 2025. Now, you saw from those graphs that, well, change should have started a long time ago. One of the main arguments that the government uses about what they're doing, they say that we're going to make change in 2050, and well, that's another way of pushing the problem out to someone else and saying it's not my problem, someone else can deal with it, and 2050 will come. You don't really need to deal with that right now and make those changes. And they're saying no, we need to do this year upon year, right now. And so they're asking for real change to happen on the governmental level right now by 2025. And thirdly, they have also said that actually, politics has failed. Parliament is not a good place for such. It cannot deal with such an existential crisis itself. And they're demanding what's called a People's Assembly, a citizens' assembly, which is much like a jury service, where citizens that are selected at random but demographically selected, that they will deliberate information provided by experts, and then will chart the best course of action, which will be legally binding. And that system will also allow, will probably means that it's far more exempt from the ability to for lobbying, which the Western democracies are so hampered by big business. Now that is all quite a lot to take in. So what can we do about it? Well, there's stuff we can do individually. We don't have to feel so helpless. So certainly we have to make changes in our own lives and the things that, in the consumption levels that we are producing, in our diets, do we need to fly, to the other end of Europe for a stag weekend, or well, could I just have a weekend at home instead? And do I really need to have new fashion every week and just limit those levels of consumption? Secondly, we need to support groups like what Extinction Rebellion are doing, and that's what in spreading the word and bringing that out, and be that by actually attending the events or even just being sympathetic to what they're trying to do, which is essentially save our lives and our children's lives, which is which is something I don't think anyone can disagree with rather. But thirdly, I think there's something quite important actually, especially in the modern age, and that is being responsible. And when I mean being responsible, I mean being responsible for the information that we take in, that we digest, and that we distribute. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of attempts to muddy the waters with misinformation or trivializing points. And we've got to take ownership and responsibility for that by questioning certain bits of information. Now, is there a hidden agenda? Who's funding this? And is that just an attempt to try and trivialize, or is that the truth? And we've got to take responsibility of that. And if people are distributing such information, well, again, we need to take responsibility of saying, no, that's not right, you can't do that. And we've got to push for the right for changes to happen. It's a massive challenge. It absolutely is. And I see this massive challenge as, I say it's quite parallel to some of the expeditions I've gone on. And we enjoy hearing stories about expeditions, about adventurers going and undertaking extraordinary journeys, because I think we enjoy hearing them because they have succeeded when the odds have been stacked against them. But you know, they don't always succeed. And when I haven't on the expedition, well, I don't feel guilty because I know I've tried everything I could to make that work. And actually, that expedition that we saw the polar bears, and at the end of the expedition that Duncan fell through the sea ice, that was actually the second time that we tried to cross the Penny ice cap. The first time, 3 years earlier, we backed out after a week on the ice. We turned around after years of planning and pretty much all our life savings being spent on there. And we turned around because my feet froze, my toes froze, and it would have been absolutely foolish to carry on. To carry on such at the beginning of the expedition would have meant I would have lost my toes, my feet, and potentially more. And it was the right decision, but I had to explain that to my partner on the expedition, whose feet were fine, but you know, we had to turn around. And it was the hardest decision I've ever had to make in my life. But it was the right decision. And I don't regret going on there because we learnt a lot from that expedition. And if we hadn't gone on that expedition, we wouldn't have attempted 3 years later, and we wouldn't have succeeded. And the views from the other side are amazing. A year before this actually, and in fact you'll see this image is quite similar, we returned in the summertime to Baffin Island, and we took a bunch of students and graduates out to Baffin Island to live amongst the Inuit and to travel trek about 300 kilometers across the Ayushuk Pass out there. And these students, they were students and graduates of natural sciences. And the point of the expedition was to develop materials for schools to interact via our web platform, our satellite phones, to schools across the UK and the world. And on top of that, I conducted a video on climate change and what the members of the expeditions thought about climate change, and this was in 2010. However, I almost didn't get a chance to finish that expedition, as we almost had a disaster as a result of the extreme temperatures that we're facing. That summer, we had 2 weeks of temperatures greater than 20 degrees Celsius. Now, across this expedition, there were a number of rivers we had to cross, and these rivers are fed by meltwater coming down from the glaciers. And this is a completely normal process, and in the wintertime, those glaciers will be replenished in the wintertime. But the high temperatures that we're facing, over 20 degrees Celsius, meant that the rivers were higher, faster, and crossing them became more dangerous. But after 3 weeks and almost 250 kilometers of trekking gone, we were almost at the end of the expedition, and we only had one more river to cross. We woke up at 4 a.m. This morning in order to cross the river, when the temperatures are at the lowest, and the rivers, as a result, are at the lowest, and the melt hasn't really started too much. And of course, in the Arctic, you've got 24 hours daylight, so really, 4 a.m. could be, 11 a.m. or 3 p.m. And so here's a picture of Anthony and Rachel, the other two leaders on the expedition, attempting to cross to see what it's like before committing to the rest of the group. And typically, we don't cross rivers that are greater than our knees height, because when they are greater than your knees height, it's hard to maintain a foothold and you're likely to slip and be washed downstream. And this is the last image that I took before we had to launch before I launched a rescue operation. I had just moments before this, I had already instructed the other group, the rest of the group, to gather themselves into 3 distinct groups and position them further downstream as I saw that they were struggling. And already here, you can see the water is above their waists and they were struggling to keep their foothold. On top of that, the Arctic water is absolutely freezing, just maybe a degree or 2 above zero. No sooner had I taken this picture that they lost their footings and slipped. And as they slipped, they fell into the water and being dragged downstream. On top of that, their bags were now being flooded with water and dragging themselves down, and they struggled to keep their heads above water. Fortunately, 2 of the teams further downstream managed to grab each one, Anthony and Rachel, and drag them back to shore. As well as being slightly hypothermic, their legs were battered and bruised, but apart from that, everyone was okay. And so I did manage to finish this film, which I'd like to show just a short excerpt of this, of Rachel and Anthony discussing.
The climate is changing and we are contributing to this, but why should we care?
Change. Why? Because well, there's since time began, it's estimated that 99% of all species on the planet have become extinct. And yes, that's nature's cycle, and kind of that's the law of nature and all the rest of it. But how long have we really been around for in terms of how are we technologically advanced? Is it since the Industrial Revolution? Is it since the birth of Christ? Is it looking back further than that? The environment we're in here, these rocks are like 2.2 billion years old. In our time scale, Industrial Revolution, 150, 200 years. In a whole scheme of things, we haven't been around for that long, but yet we're having the biggest impact on the planet. Why is that important? Because, we need to, be very aware that we don't slide into that 99% category just yet.
I think we need to, for the wider population, we need it to conserve our environment that we thrive in so well, because it's the perfect environment that we can live in. But for me personally, I love the planet as it is. I want all the species there. I want to learn. I want to go into the rainforest and see them there. I don't want to go into a patch of grass full of cows for McDonald's burgers. I want to actually go into the Amazon. I want to be able to go onto the ice caps and see them and experience the world how it is. And then I think for the wider world, it's the environment that we thrive in. And we need it. Otherwise, we don't know how we're going to survive afterwards.
Limiting climate change is not about saving the planet. This planet has endured climatic conditions that are far more extreme than what we are talking about. But our very evolution has been adapted for this relatively cool period in the Earth's climate, and all of our advanced technologies and societies relies on it. I would like to finish off with just reiterating what Rachel said at the end of that video. For me personally, I want to go into the rainforest and onto the ice caps, but it's bigger than that. We need it, otherwise we don't know how we're going to survive. Thank you.